Welcome to Unfinished Work, Women in the Public Spotlight. This event is sponsored by MassMutual. MassMutual was founded on the principle of people protecting people. In celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, we can collectively learn from the brave women of the past and look out for those who continue to strive to make a better world today. Because together, we're much stronger. To learn more, visit massmutual.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second event in our series, Unfinished Work, which explores the legacy of the suffrage movement and how women continue to fight for equal rights. I'm Monica Drake, an assistant managing editor at the New York Times, and I'm excited to be here today with Representative Debra Haaland of New Mexico and Reshma Saujani, CEO of Girls Who Code. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Representative Haaland was elected in 2018 and became one of the first Native Americans to serve in Congress. During her term, she's focused her attention on her community as well as on natural resources and the armed forces. And Reshma Saujani founded Girls Who Code, an international nonprofit organization working to close the gender gap in technology. A quick housekeeping note, you'll be able to submit questions for the panel at any time during this event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll get to them in a little bit. And please also note this event is being recorded. So let's get started. Let's dive right in. First, I kind of wanted to level set here. We're having this conversation because this year is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Which gave women the right to vote, though of course not all women were in practice allowed to vote at that time. That amendment came about because of decades of hard work by women who ignored rules and norms about what they were supposed to do or even allowed to do in the public spotlight. So today we're talking about how women occupy the public sphere now, which includes both of you. So my first question is, how did you realize that as part of your work, you wanted to be in the public sphere? Was there a single moment or was it a gradual realization? Representative Haaland, we can start out with you.
You know, I started my political career because I wanted more Native Americans to vote. That was really the whole impetus to me getting involved. It was because I felt like we deserved to have a voice in our politics. And so I started volunteering for candidates I liked. And that eventually led me to I was a full-time volunteer for several campaigns and then eventually became a staffer. But for me, it was that I saw a need and I wanted to fill that need. And of course, you never know where these experiences will take you. I ended up running for lieutenant governor in 2014 and here I am today. But I've always felt like if you work hard, you can accomplish your goals. And so I went into this endeavor with that in mind, and there's much more work left to do, of course, but that's really how I got started.
So it sounds like you never really had any doubts about this course for yourself.
No, I didn't know what I would do with it. I really just wanted more people to vote, more Native Americans to vote. And then eventually I thought, I would be in places where I would see elected officials, and I started thinking, I could do that, right? And so when a few things opened up, I decided just to run, and it really helped me. I, as a Native woman, I just want to say, and one of the first 2 Native American women ever elected to Congress in our country's history, I got a lot of folks who would say things like, I don't do identity politics, when I would say my tagline was, Congress has never heard a voice like mine. Well, if you've always been represented, then it's a, you know, you can say that. But for those of us who have never seen ourselves in Congress or anywhere else in our elected, you know, plethora of elected officials, then I just, you know, we need to be out there, and we need to make sure that we are representing, we're filling that void. Everybody deserves to have representation in this country. And it's ironic that I'm a 35th generation New Mexican. My ancestors migrated from various areas to the place in the Southwest where we live now in the year, you know, in the late 1200s. And yet we had never had a woman in Congress. So here I am, ready to represent not just Native women, but people of color, single moms, people who haven't had a voice in their politics. So I take all of my experiences, I bring them with me to Washington, D.C., and they you know, fuel my perspective on what it is we need to do as a country.
Great. And Reshma, you know, was your path similar? Were you motivated by your community? I know you started out as a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was moved. My parents came here as refugees in 1973, and they were 2 of 1,000 refugees who got status to come here. And so, like, my father, when I was little, would always read to me about, like, Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. And so from the time I was a little girl, like, I had this, like, deep love for our country. And I always thought that the way that I would give back would be by being a public servant. Now, we grew up as one of the few Indian families in our neighborhood, like in the Midwest. And when my mother would wear a sari to the local Kmart, you know, she would get made fun of. Like, our house would get teepeed. I got into my first fight in a schoolyard when I was 12 years old because I was called a Haji. So I was always very aware of my identity. And in many ways, I think very ashamed of it because I didn't feel like I belonged. And so I was always very moved towards justice and equality and fairness and equity. But I believe that, you know, we say in Hinduism, what's your dharma? Like, what does God put you on this earth to do? For me, I thought I would serve and run for office. I graduated with $300,000 in student loan debt, ended up working in finance in a job I hated, and I felt stuck. I remember when I got my first paycheck, my father framed it because they had never seen so much money before. But I knew that that wasn't my purpose. And in 2010, I decided to run for Congress against a 10-year incumbent, Congresswoman Maloney. I failed spectacularly, you know, got less than 19% of the vote. But it was a realization for me about failure, right? It's like, we think we know what our journey is, but unless you try and you fail, you don't know where you're supposed to be. So I thought that my journey was always in Congress. But what my journey, and especially in the middle of this COVID crisis, it's so clear to me, like, again, what my dharma is that my journey was actually to teach generations of girls to be change makers so that they can code a cure to the virus, so they can help small businesses right now, so they can make sure that people who are hungry and who don't have food, so they can make sure that the 55 million kids that are out of school have an opportunity to march into the middle class. And so I always tell young people, and quite frankly, I tell women, it's like, be open to your failures. Do you be open to who you think and where you think you might be and where you actually end up?
That's pretty interesting that you kind of, you know, you found a different path. Can each of you talk a little bit about, you know, those first, the sort of first steps of, after you realized, hey, this is what I think I want to do. Can you recall the first moment that you maybe stepped on a podium or just felt like you made your entrance in the public sphere? Was it a speech? Where, you know, what was the audience reception? Just talk a little bit about that, and whether you were nervous or, you know, or just felt like you just belonged there, sort of leading people. Reshma, do you want to start?
Sure. I think for me, when it comes to Girls Who Code, it's probably every time I'm speaking at a tech conference in a room full of men. And I'm talking to them about women and about power and about why it matters that girls should learn how to code. And I feel like, you know, I always say, I wrote a book, Brave Not Perfect, and I always say, you know, bravery doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it's like we think that we say the bold thing, we say the thing that nobody else wants to say, and we're going to get this immediate rush and this sense of, oh, I feel like a hero. Actually, it's quite scary. And so for me, I think that every time I speak to an audience where I speak truth to power and I see the uncomfortable looks in the audience, and then afterwards I see the nodding and I see people come up to me and say, you know what, that makes sense. Like I see that in my daughter. I'm going to do that as a CEO, right? I'm going to make these changes. I'm going to fight for diversity and inclusion. That's when I realized, you know, that the work that I'm meant to do is exactly the work that I'm doing right now.
And what about you, Representative Haaland?
So I just want to say that every single time I have to talk publicly, I get scared. I get very nervous. I'm just still not comfortable with it, even though it seems like I'm doing it all the time. It's just something that doesn't go away with me. But I suppose that's fine. You know, I graduated from law school in 2006. And in 2007, I was recruited to apply to Emerge New Mexico. It's part of the larger Emerge America political leadership training program for Democratic women. My con law professor called me, she was on the board, and asked me if I would apply. And I was really surprised, right? I was feeling like, and now I feel like this more than ever, that we don't recognize in ourselves what other people see in us, right? Somebody thought that I would be good in a political leadership training program. I would have never in a million years thought that of myself. So it's important that we are always vocal about how we're approaching other women. It takes a woman 7 times before she says yes. If you can ask a woman 7 times to run for office and she'll finally say yes, you ask a man once and he says yes right away the first time. So it's important that we're consistent, that we keep telling women, you can do this. This is a place for you. You deserve to be in office. You can work that hard. You can raise that much money. You can do X, Y, and Z, whatever it takes to win an election. But for me, I can't really say if there was a moment. I didn't decide to run for Congress until 2 weeks before I actually did it. And so it's difficult sometimes I still feel very not at all comfortable with, doing anything. I have to give it a lot of thought. I have to be confident that I can work that hard, or I can say the right things, or I can do whatever it takes to, achieve whatever goal that I'm working on. But I feel I'm happy, of course, that I said yes. And so I can't necessarily say that it was one particular moment where I thought I could run for a congressional seat and win. What I thought when I ran for this seat was there had never been a Native American woman in Congress, and we really deserve to have representation. And if no one else was going to do it, and I should say that many Native women before me had tried, but not been successment, then I had to try, and I had to do it. And for me, it is what I lack in anything else, I make up for with hard work. So when I got out there and I had, men saying, she can't raise the money, she can't win the seat, she won't be able to do it. I just worked a lot harder, because I felt like if we work hard, we can accomplish things that you can't imagine.
And how did being, how did being a first, or you became the first Native American woman, I think, to lead a state party as well. How did being a first really affect your public persona and your advocacy, or did it affect that, and how did it affect that?
Right. So when I ran for state party chair, it was a bad year for Democrats. The year before I ran, 2014, we lost our state house. We did terrible in the elections across the country. And so I decided to run. I had just finished running for lieutenant governor, and we lost that race in New Mexico. So we had a second term Republican governor in 2014. But I decided to run for state chair because I felt like I knew what our party needed. And I knew the hard work part, it always figures in. We were, in debt. Our party was in debt. We had lost our state house. We needed to really make a turnaround. So I felt like it was an opportunity for me to work that hard and to implement my ideas. And sure enough, we turned everything around in 2016 and we won. But I'll say that during the time I was running against a male who called me more than once to ask if I would just be his vice chair, and not run for chair of the party. So it's interesting. I feel like if you're a woman and you're running for something, just stay strong no matter who tries to bring you down. People are supporting you because you're running for that office, not because you're running for, the second runner-up or whatever. So I'm happy that I stuck with it because we did some good things for our party, very inclusive things.
That's really interesting. I imagine, I don't know if you returned the favor and invited him to be your vice chair. You did. Reshma, you focus particularly on young women. You mentioned some of the reasons why. I have a similar question for you. Just how did being a woman and Indian American woman influence your public presence, and how does it do that today?
Yeah, I mean, I was the first South Asian woman to run for Congress. I lost, and there's been amazing South Asian women who've been elected since then, which I'm incredibly excited about. Look, I think it's always hard to be the first, because I think that pressure to be perfect, that pressure to not make a mistake is even more prominent, especially for women of color, right? And you often hear that with women of color in the spotlight, because, and with men, there's so much more of a acceptance of failure and making mistakes. Like, I always joke that in Silicon Valley, like, you can't even get funded unless you've had 3 failed startups. But for women, it's like, I don't know, she missed Q3. I don't know if we can invest in her. Studies show that young Black girls are expelled from school at twice the rate of other kids. Women are expelled from the bar at twice the rate. I mean, study after study after study shows that mistakes, failure, there's higher consequences for women than there are for men. And those consequences are even greater when you're a woman of color. And so certainly in many of my decision-making, that played in. Also, I think being the daughter of immigrants, my parents always taught me to not call attention to myself. You know what I mean? To be quiet, to be demure. And so especially when I got passionate about politics, my parents were incredibly not supportive of that. And so for me, kind of breaking the good girl mold was quite challenging, because I had a lot of my parents' expectations, the sacrifices they've made, kind of weighing on me. And, I wasn't able to really pursue my passion for public service until I was 33 years old. And so what I have found is that by being imperfect, by taking risks, by inviting failure in my life, I have been able to do things I never thought that I would be able to do. You know, it's funny, Congressman, you talk a lot about hard work. And I think that one of the things that I feel like I have learned, you know, Carol Dweck has this great line where if life were one long grade school, girls would rule the world, but it's not. And we have been working hard and crossing our T's and dotting our I's and doing everything perfectly. But the guys who fake it till they make it, who raise their hands for promotions they're not qualified for, who don't wait their turn to run for office, but just run on a whim, they're president of the United States right now. And so I've been thinking a lot about, you know, what are the messages in this generation, especially in the middle of this economic crisis? Do we say about risk taking and about going for it and about being honest about whether does hard work really pay off? Because when it doesn't, we often think that there's something wrong with us. And I think that that is one of the things for me in particular, when I worked really hard and I didn't get that thing. I mean, I worked really hard to get elected to Congress. I worked really hard to get elected to public advocate, and it didn't work out. And so I want to make sure that like we are encouraging our girls to pursue excellence, because I know you and I do. And so much of what we've accomplished in our lives is because of that pursuit of excellence. But there's a difference between excellence and perfection.
That's really interesting. That kind of connects to what I wanted to talk a little bit about next, which is you know, the women who did break barriers and rules all those years ago. You know, they were people who didn't necessarily play by society's rules then. Women weren't allowed to make political speeches, so they turned their messages into songs and sang them. Other women set up protest voting stations outside of real ones. You know, what are some really effective ways in this moment to do the equivalent of that, to kind of realize your goals, or perhaps those of the communities that you serve, by adopting tactics and practices that aren't the norm? Representative Haaland?
Sure. Reshma, thank you so much for everything. I'm totally inspired. You know, I was thinking of, I didn't have a Native woman to look up to or call on the phone and say, what is it like to run, you know, to be in Congress or anything like that. So I mean, in a way, I made up some of my own rules as I went along, but one of them, for me, I was very open about I have an addiction. I was addicted to alcohol, and I had 2 DWIs in my past 35 years ago. And I was very open about that. I brought that out in my very first ad that I aired on television. And I felt like I just wanted to be as transparent as I possibly could, because I didn't want anybody hitting me on anything later on. But also, I felt like my experiences are important. We have experiences as women of color, and, you know, in a way, I've been poor. I had to be on food stamps with my daughter at one point in my life. We were homeless several times, where I had to sleep on friends' couches. I'm very lucky to have friends whose couches I can sleep on, because a lot of people are not that lucky. But I just felt like I needed to just like brand myself as honest, transparent, and not, not sort of try to fit into a mold of other politicians. I just felt like that didn't work for me. I really feel like in this day and age that we all need to just be honest about who we are, and show the world that, yes, I understand what it's like to be you. I understand what it's like to live with addiction. I understand what it's like to sit in the office of the, you know, the SNAP benefit counselor and cry your eyes out because you don't qualify for emergency food stamps. I know what all those things are like. And so, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but I just feel like we need to be who we are. Voters want somebody who's real, not a canned politician. I just feel like that, and maybe that works in some areas, but as a woman of color and somebody who is very proud, you know, it was the early 20s, my grandmother and my grandfather moved to Winslow, Arizona to work on the railroad. It was part of the assimilation policies of the United States government. And my grandmother cleaned diesel train engines with a bucket of kerosene and a brush. She led a graveyard shift of women, and they would clean the diesel engines, and then the trains would go out in the morning. Women didn't work back then, but my grandmother worked. She decided that's what she had to do. And so I just, you know, I have examples like her to live by. And so I really just feel like as women, as politicians, as, you know, candidates, we really need to be who we are and not who we're not.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of connection between that and what Reshma said, which is sort of being transparent about your own failures, missteps. Reshma, is there anything else you have to say about just effective ways in this moment to kind of lead in a non-traditional way that's a bit, you know,
yeah,
a bit like coloring outside the lines?
Well, I love what the Congressman was talking about, because I think that's so powerful. And this idea, especially now as we're in these remote working environments, of like showing the mess behind the scenes. You know, invariably when I'm on a Zoom call with women and men, when someone's dog is barking or their child is trying to open the door, what do women do? We turn off the video and we turn off the audio. What do the men do? They grab their kids and like, oh, look at Tommy, isn't he so cute? And so we feel all of this pressure to like show this perfect life, right? With no clothes in the background and no kids marching in, and it's exhausting us. And we're seeing that the impact of the epidemic on women is huge. They're leaving their jobs, right? They're basically having anxiety and depression at higher rates than men. And so we have got to be honest and transparent that this is hard, and that life is messy, and that leadership is messy. I think the second thing that I've also really learned about leadership, especially right now, is that courage is challenging too. And what's the point of being a leader if you can't be courageous? And I have, you know, as the CEO of Girls Who Code, where the majority of my funding comes from corporates, I have been very public in calling out companies for their lack of privacy or transparency, or not supporting walkouts by their women and with people of color. And we have had real consequences for that. I mean, we joke as a team that I think last year my mouth cost us $10 million. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way, because there's no point of being a leader. There's no point of standing for what is right if you can't change something. And I think in this moment, especially I think for us as women of color, it isn't easy, because we're expected to stay in our place. And oftentimes we've been raised to do that. And I do think that this, again, is a moment for women and for people of color to really kind of stand up and to fight for what's right. And it's harder because the ones who are being affected by the unemployment crisis, by the health crisis, are women and are people of color.
It's pretty moving. I think I have time for, well, it looks like I have time for a couple more questions before we go to audience questions. One is that, you know, as a nation right now, there's plenty of things that we disagree about. One is to what extent that we have reached equality in this nation for women, elective or otherwise. How much work do you think remains to be done, and what is that work? Representative Haaland, I'll start with you.
So, gosh, there is a lot of work left to be done. And Reshma just outlined a lot of it. Right now, there's 23% of women in Congress, and there should be 50, right? So that work remains to be done. Women are still doing the bulk of, she laid it out right there, right? The bulk of the housework, the bulk of, it's part of when I said women need to be asked 7 times before they will say yes to running for office. It's a lot of it is who's going to, do the ironing, who's going to wash the clothes, who's going to cook the dinners if I'm running for office. Those are the questions that women ask themselves. So, I take a lot of pride in the things that I learned from my mother. I hang my clothes out to dry because I don't, on a clothesline, because that's part of what I do for, I want to save the 6,000 pounds of carbon from going into the atmosphere by hanging my clothes out every time. I do things like that, and I feel pride from that, right? But at the same time, there are larger things. And the only way we're going to accomplish the things that women need is if more women are in Congress and they have a seat at the table. More women are the ones who are asking the questions of the administration, who are fighting for Medicare for all and making sure that, universal child care is an absolute thing, right? It's something that people can access. We need to have our seats at the table so that we can fight for the things that women need, and who better to fight for those things than us? I recall not too long ago, it was several years before I even decided to run. I remember there was a committee hearing about, women's reproductive rights or birth control pills or something like that. And the witnesses that the Republicans invited, they were all men, right? Those types of things need to stop. Women need to talk about their own issues. So it's having events like this even, right? Bringing women to the table and letting us talk about the real issues in our everyday lives and how it impacts the actual work that we're doing. So I'm always going to leave the ladder down. Now that I have a seat in Congress, I'm helping a lot of women right now with this election. I am giving them support financially. I'm giving them advice. I'm making phone calls for them, having Zoom events, because I want more women elected to Congress. And I want to reach that 50% before, I get too old to appreciate it. So I am actively working to make sure that more women have a seat at the table. And I'll absolutely continue to do that, leaving the ladder down. I want more Native women in Congress as well.
And this is actually the last question. It's the same question for you, Reshma. What is the sort of most important thing to sort of work on for women's equality right now?
Yeah, I agree with everything that the Congresswoman shared about. And, I am laser focused right now on the impact of women's and girls' progress that we've made and not being rolled back because of the health crisis. We have, again, 55 million kids who have been, remote learning. 13 million of them don't have Wi-Fi. The vast majority of those are also girls. So you have girls who are not logging on to school right now, or trying to get Wi-Fi in a Burger King parking lot, or who won't be able to go to college in the fall because they're caring for an elderly patient or elderly parent or a child, a sibling. What are we doing about that? What are we doing to make sure all of these organizations, all of the progress that we've made over the past decade don't simply get rolled back? And we need to focus on the impact. We're already seeing this, right? The double shift that Sheryl Sandberg's been talking about. We're seeing the articles where women are basically choosing, or it's not even a choice, of leaving their jobs because to manage what's happening at home, and that we're just simply exhausted and being impacted by this crisis in ways that men simply aren't. And so we need to be laser focused on this and make sure that all of the gains that we have made are not rolled back, because it matters who's in the room. The congresswoman talked about how it matters in Washington. Well, it matters in technology too. You know, when we think about the innovations that are being made, when we think about the algorithms that are being built, when we think about the progress that we're trying to shape, if women aren't in the room, it's not going to reflect the things that matter to us. And I always say, like, 73% of girls want to change the world. When you think about every single movement over the past year and a half, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's about gun reform, whether it's about climate change, it's been led by girls. It's been led by young people. In a moment right now where our leaders are behaving like children, our children are behaving like leaders. So what are we doing to invest in them and their education in this moment right now? And that should be our focus.
Thanks. So right now, what I want to do is take a few questions from the audience. We have a lot. The first one is for each of you. Who do you both look up to as role models, past or present? Representative Haaland, I see you smiling, so I think you've thought of someone.
Thank you. So Dolores Huerta is one of my all-time favorite persons in the entire world. Her fight for farm workers, for women, for children. She has an amazing story. She is still fighting, and she will fight until she can't fight anymore. So Dolores Huerta, and I'm so grateful to know her and see her in action. Every year we have a Cesar Chavez March in Albuquerque. She comes there every time, and I should say she was born in New Mexico, so we claim her as a New Mexican as well. But also, Shirley Chisholm was the very first African-American woman ever elected to Congress, and she was elected 50 years before I was. So I felt that was significant. I also admire her so much. When she first came to Congress, she had an all-Black woman staff. So she wasn't afraid to just put it out there. And I am inspired by her every single day as well.
And how about you, Reshma?
You know, I've always been inspired by Hillary Clinton. And one of the reasons why I love about her is, one, her passion and her commitment has always been consistent. She's always been there in the arena, fighting for women and girls and fighting for people who have not been, treated right or justly. The other thing that I've always been, that she's always moved me by, is her resilience. Like, I always watch her like dust off that pantsuit and just keep going, no matter what they say about her. No matter whether they like her or don't like her, she has her North Star very clear. And I think in this moment where girls are looking for role models, especially looking for role models who fail, who things don't work out for them, but who keep on getting up and keep going, I think it's really important. And then some of my other role models are Katherine Johnson and the ENIAC women, and all of these incredible women and women of color in tech, who have changed the world. And whose stories haven't been recognized.
This is an interesting question from a listener, Anne. She says a lot of attention is given to the task of getting men to vote for women. How do we get women to vote for women? And Reshma, I'll start with you, since you just mentioned Hillary Clinton.
It was one of the things that I felt like I've been thinking a lot about after I wrote my book is like, what is this relationship that we have with one another? Why are we sometimes not nice to each other or support one another? And I think a lot of that comes from regret and envy. So many of us let our good ideas die on the vine. We want to run for office and we talk ourselves out of it. We want to start a company and we tell ourselves why we can't do it. We can't silence that voice in our head. But what then happens is that we see someone else doing the very thing that we told ourselves we can't do, and it leaves us with regret and envy. And when we think about why people don't like Hillary Clinton, why people don't like Kamala Harris, why people don't like Stacey Abrams, or these strong, powerful women who've changed the world and changed kind of what the face of leadership looks like, I think a lot of it is about regret and envy. So what I say to women is go to your regret and envy, go to where that sits for you inside your stomach. And I think once we start working on that, we'll start building sisterhood with one another.
And Representative Haaland, I'm sure you have plenty of experience campaigning.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I come from a really, New Mexico's first district. It's a fairly progressive district, and I ran on a progressive agenda. So I got a lot of women to vote for me because of my platform, right? The environment was the #1 thing on my platform. And so I feel like, sometimes when you're running for office, you have to, straddle, right? And I feel the same way you do, Reshma, about Hillary. The most amazing, hardworking candidate, period, that we could ever have for president. And we see how that turned out. I want to, look, I try to listen, I try to be responsive and all of those things as a candidate. And I just want to be the example that I think we need. And I support women. As I mentioned earlier, that's what we're doing this election. And so I think it just like we still have to work on that.
Can I add to that? I think it's such an important point, Congresswoman, because maybe we just have to stop saying that women don't support women, because they do, right? They have for you, they have for me. I see it in my girls every single day. There is this very powerful sisterhood. Now, it's not 100% pure, but maybe we just have to put something different into the universe.
That's great. Yeah.
In the last audience question for each of you is, if you were asked to put together an exhibit reflecting on the Suffrage Centennial anniversary, what would be the one most important point or message? Representative Haaland.
Sure, I would. So I would have a picture of my grandmother in her overalls and her railroad cap, because we have to remember that there were a lot of women of color who couldn't vote at the time that the 19th Amendment passed. Native Americans weren't considered citizens of the United States until 1924. And in a lot of states across the country, New Mexico, for example, Native Americans, whether you were women or men, couldn't vote until 1948, when the state was sued by a World War II veteran. So I would want to make sure that people knew and understood that the fight wasn't the same for women of color. Women of color still couldn't vote. We're grateful that the fight went on and that eventually, we were able to vote. But I just want everyone to recognize that my grandmother was one of those people who couldn't vote, and she couldn't vote until 1948.
And what about you, Reshma?
I would have a picture of our girls who code, and I would highlight the things that they're doing and how girls are change makers. You know, one of my alumni right now is 3D printing, you know, PPE equipment for healthcare workers in New York City. And she's giving it out. And like every day I wake up to see the incredible things that my students are doing, the apps that they're building for small businesses, the algorithms they're building to find cures to cancer, the games that they're building to educate people about undocumented immigrants and why they are fundamentally American. So for me, it's about highlighting so much of our hope, our humanity, rest in girls and in the way that they see the world and the impact that they're making.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Representative Haaland and Reshma Saujani. Our next unfinished work event is going to take place at 4 p.m. Eastern on June 15th about queering women's stories, artists and the fight for women's rights. And the series continues throughout the summer with events in July and August as well. To find out more about our slate of virtual events at the Times, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. I'd also like to give a special thank you to our subscribers. You make our work possible. Thank you.